Scottish Gaelic literature refers to literature composed in the Scottish Gaelic language, a member of the Goidelic branch of Celtic languages, along with Irish and Manx. Middle Ages. Early Middle Ages. In early Middle Ages, what is now Scotland was culturally and politically divided. In the west were the Gaelic-speaking people of Dalriata, who had close links with Ireland, from where they brought with them the name Scots. Very few works of Gaelic poetry survive from the early medieval period, and most of these are in Irish manuscripts. There are religious works that can be identified as Scottish, including the Elegy for St. Columba by Darlan Fagale and In Praise of St. Columba by Began MacLuigdech of Rum, c. 677. A series of anecdotes contained in the 10th century Betba Adam Nain are probably derived from works composed on Iona. Outside of these, there are few poems in praise of Pictish kings contained within Irish annals that are probably from Scotland. Beginning in the later 8th century, Viking raids and invasions may have forced a merger of the Gaelic and Pictish crowns. The Kingdom of Alba emerged, which would eventually become known as the Kingdom of Scotland, and traced its origin to Syned Mac Alpin in the 840s through the House of Alpin. The Kingdom of Alba was overwhelmingly an oral society dominated by Gaelic culture. Fuller sources for Ireland of the same period suggest that there would have been Fili, who acted as poets, musicians and historians, often attached to the court of a lord or king, and passed on the knowledge and culture in Gaelic to the next generation. High Middle Ages, at least from the accession of David I, as part of a Davidian revolution that introduced French culture and political systems. Gaelic ceased to be the main language of the royal court and was probably replaced by French. After this de-Gaelicization of the Scottish court, a less highly regarded order of bards took over the functions of the Fili, and they would continue to act in a similar role in the Highlands and Islands into the 18th century. They often trained in bardic schools. A few of these, like the one run by the MacMurdoch dynasty, who were bards to the Lord of the Isles, continued until they were suppressed from the 17th century. Members of bardic schools were trained in the complex rules and forms of Gaelic poetry. Much of the work was never written down, and what survives was only recorded from the 16th century. It is possible that more Middle Irish literature was written in medieval Scotland than is often thought, but has not survived because the Gaelic literary establishment of eastern Scotland died out before the 14th century. Thomas Owen Clancy has argued that the Liber Bretonic, the so-called Irish Nennius, was written in Scotland, and probably at the monastery in Abernethy, but this text survives only from manuscripts preserved in Ireland. Other literary works that have survived include that of the prolific poet Gilbride Albanic. His heading for Damietta dealt with his experiences of the Fifth Crusade. Late Middle Ages. In the late Middle Ages, Middle Scots, often simply called English, became the dominant language of the country. It was derived largely from Old English, with the addition of elements from Gaelic and French. Although resembling the language spoken in northern England, it became a distinct dialect from the late 14th century onwards. As the ruling elite gradually abandoned French, they began to adopt Middle Scots, and by the 15th century it was the language of government, with Acts of Parliament, council records and treasurers' accounts almost all using it from the reign of James I onwards. As a result, Gaelic, once dominant north of the Tay, began a steady decline. Lowland writers began to treat Gaelic as a second-class, rustic and even amusing language, helping to frame attitudes towards the Highlands and to create a cultural gulf with the Lowlands. The major corpus of medieval Scottish Gaelic poetry, the Book of the Dún of Lismore, was compiled by the brothers James and Donald MacGregor in the early decades of the 16th century. Besides Scottish Gaelic verse, it contains a large number of of poems composed in Ireland as well as verse and prose in Scots and Latin. The subject matter includes love poetry, heroic ballads and philosophical pieces. It also is notable for containing poetry by at least 4 women. These include Aithbriac Nai and Goidelic, who wrote a lament for her husband, the Constable of Castlesween. Walter Kennedy, one of the makers associated with the court of James IV, may have written works in the language, although only examples of his poetry in Scots survive. The Book of Common Order was translated into Scottish Gaelic by Sion Casiul, Bishop of the Isles, and printed in 1567. This is considered the first printed book in Scottish Gaelic, though the language resembles Classical Irish. Early Modern Era. By the early modern era, Gaelic had been in geographical decline for 3 centuries and had begun to be a second-class language, confined to the Highlands and Islands. The tradition of classic Gaelic poetry survived longer in Scotland than in Ireland, with the last fully competent member of the MacMurdoch dynasty, who were hereditary poets to the Lords of the Isles and then the Donalds of Clan Ranald, still working in the early 18th century. Nevertheless, interest in the sponsorship of panegyric Gaelic poetry was declining among the clan leaders. Gaelic was gradually being overtaken by Middle Scots, which became the language of both the nobility and the majority population. Middle Scots was derived substantially from Old English, with Gaelic and French influences. It was usually called English and was very close to the language spoken in northern England, unlike many of his predecessors. James VI actively despised Gaelic culture. As the tradition of classical Gaelic poetry declined, a new tradition of vernacular Gaelic poetry began to emerge. While classical poetry used a language largely fixed in the 12th century, the vernacular continued to develop, in contrast to the classical tradition, which used syllabic meter. Vernacular poets tended to use stressed meter. However, they shared with the classic poets a set of complex metaphors and role, as the verse was still often panegyric. A number of these vernacular poets were women, such as Mary MacLeod of Harris. Ian Lom was a royalist Scottish Gaelic poet appointed Poet Laureate in Scotland by Charles II at the Restoration. He delivered a eulogy for the coronation, and remained loyal to the Stuarts after 1688, opposing the Williamites and later, in his vituperative Oren and Aga Ionanade, the 1707 Union of the Parliaments. 18th century. The use of Scottish Gaelic suffered when Highlanders were persecuted after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and during the Highland clearances. The Scottish Gaelic Enlightenment figure Alasdair MacWhystere Alasdair compiled the first secular book in Scottish Gaelic to be printed, Liber Theogascain Minan, a Gaelic English glossary. The second secular book in Scottish Gaelic to be published was his poetry collection Ais Erin Sean Shannon Albanarich. His lexicography and poetry was informed by his study of Old Gaelic manuscripts, an antiquarian interest which also influenced the orthography he employed. As an observer of the natural world of Scotland and a Jacobite rebel, Alasdair MacWhystere Alasdair was the most overtly nationalist poet in Gaelic of the 18th century. His Ais Erin Sean Shannon Albanarich was reported to have been burned in public by the hangman in Edinburgh. He was influenced by James Thomson's The Seasons as well as by Gaelic village poets, such as Ian MacFhatcher. As part of the oral literature of the Highlands, few of the works of such village poets were published at the time, although some have been collected since. Scottish Gaelic poets produced laments on the Jacobite defeats of 1715 and 1745. Margaret Nyan Lochlan and Katrina Nick Fergheis are among woman poets who reflected on the crushing effects on traditional Gaelic culture of the aftermath of the Jacobite uprisings. A consequent sense of desolation pervaded the works of Scottish Gaelic writers such as Duffield Buchanan, which mirrored many of the themes of the graveyard poets writing in England. A legacy of Jacobite verse was later compiled by James Hogg in his Jacobite Relics. Don Chardban Mac and Tsaoir is one of the most renowned of Scottish Gaelic poets and formed an integral part of one of the golden ages of Gaelic poetry in Scotland during the 18th century. He is best known for his poem about Ben Doran, Malad Ben Dobrain. Most of his poetry is descriptive, and the influence of Alasdair MacQuistir Alasdair is notable in much of it. Despite the Jacobite upheavals during his lifetime, it was his experience as a gamekeeper in Argyll and Perthshire in the employ of the Duke of Argyll which had greatest impact upon his poetry. Malad Ben Dobrain stems from this period. The significance of Duncan Ban's nature-themed poetry is such that it has, along with that of MacQuistir Alasdair, been described as the zenith of Gaelic nature poetry. The Ossian of James Macpherson. James Macpherson was the first Scottish poet to gain an international reputation. Claiming to have found poetry written by Ossian, he published translations from the Gaelic that acquired international popularity, being proclaimed as a Celtic equivalent of the classical epics. Fingal, written in 1762, was speedily translated into many European languages, and its deep appreciation of natural beauty and the melancholy tenderness of its treatment of the ancient legend did more than any single work to bring about the Romantic movement in European, and especially in German literature, influencing Herder and Goethe. Eventually it became clear that the poems were not direct translations from the Gaelic, but flowery adaptations made to suit the aesthetic expectations of his audience. Bible translation. An Irish Gaelic translation of the Bible dating from the Elizabethan period, but revised in the 1680s, was in use until the Bible was translated into Scottish Gaelic. Author David Ross notes in his 2002 History of Scotland that a Scottish Gaelic version of the Bible was published in London in 1690 by the Rev. Robert Kirk, minister of Aberfoyle. However, it was not widely circulated. The first well-known translation of the Bible into modern Scottish Gaelic was begun in 1767 when Dr. James Stewart of Killen and Dugald Buchanan of Rannoch produced a translation of the New Testament. Very few European languages have made the transition to a modern literary language without an early modern translation of the Bible. The lack of a well-known translation until the late 18th century may have contributed to the decline of Scottish Gaelic. 19th century. The Highland clearances and widespread emigration significantly weakened Gaelic language and culture and had a profound impact on the nature of Gaelic poetry. The best poetry in this vein contained a strong element of protest, including Ulim Mac Dunleaber's protest against the Islay clearances in Fios Tune Bud and Sion Ed Fadre Gaisiadair's long, emotional condemnation of those responsible for the clearances Spirde Charthane. The best-known Gaelic poet of the era was Mari Mho Nan Oran, whose verse was criticized for a lack of intellectual weight, but which embodies the spirit of the land agitation of the 1870s and 1880s and whose evocation of place and mood has made her among the most enduring Gaelic poets. Ewan MacLachlan translated the first 8 books of Homer's Iliad into Scottish Gaelic. He also composed and published his own Gaelic attempts in verse and metrical effusions, and contributed greatly to the 1828 Gaelic English Dictionary. The poetry of Alan MacDonald is mainly religious in nature. He composed hymns and verse in honor of the Blessed Virgin, the Christ Child, and the Eucharist. However, several secular poems and songs were also composed by him. In some of these, MacDonald praises the beauty of Eriskay and its people. In his verse drama, Parliamade Nan Caich, he lampoons the gossiping of his female parishioners and local marriage customs. 20th century. The revitalization of Gaelic poetry in the 20th century, known as the Scottish Gaelic Renaissance, was largely due to the work of Sorley MacLean, a native of Rossi and a native Gaelic speaker. He abandoned the stylistic conventions of the tradition and opened up new possibilities for composition with his poem Dain Do I'm Here. His work inspired a new generation to take up Ní Bardacht. These included George Campbell Hay, Lewis-born poets Derek Thompson and Ian Crichton Smith. They all focused on the issues of exile, the fate of the Gaelic language and biculturalism. Domhnall Ruaidhrí was a Scottish Gaelic poet who served in the First World War, and as a war poet described the use of poison gas in his poem Moran Fuanchan. His poetry is part of oral literature, as he himself never learned to read and write in his native language. Éomas MacNicol, amongst the most prominent post-war Gaelic poets, was influenced by New American poetry, particularly the Black Mountain School. The 1960s and 1970s also saw the flourishing of Scottish Gaelic drama. Key figures included Ian Crichton Smith, whose plays explored wide-ranging themes, often humorous. They also dealt with serious topics such as the betrayal of Christin and coilage of the Highland clearances in Echuart. Ian Moirich's plays also used humour to deal with serious subjects, as in Fuma Ishena Bithgerichte, which focused on threats to the Gaelic language. Other major figures included Tormod Callum Domhnalach, whose work included Anna Chambule, which was influenced by Japanese no theatre. Finla MacLeod's work included Cian Cropic, which was strongly influenced by the theatre of the absurd. Similarly, Donald MacIlithan made use of absurd dialogue in and Scoil Du. Many of these authors continued writing into the 1980s and even the 1990s, but this was something of a golden age for Gaelic drama that has not been matched. The first novel in Scottish Gaelic was John McCormack's Dun Alwyn no Tíoire na Diobarak, which was serialized in the People's Journal in 1910, before publication in book form in 1912. The publication of a second Scottish Gaelic novel, Antioga More by Angus Robertson, followed within a year. Modern Gaelic poetry has been most influenced by symbolism, transmitted via poetry in English, and by Scots poetry. Traditional Gaelic poetry utilized an elaborate system of metres, which modern poets have adapted to their own ends. George Campbell Hay looks back beyond the popular metres of the 19th and 20th centuries to forms of early Gaelic poetry. Donald Macaulay's poetry is concerned with place and community. The following generation of Gaelic poets writing at the end of the 20th century lived in a bilingual world to a greater extent than any other generation, with the work most often accompanied in publication by a facing text in English. Such confrontation has inspired semantic experimentation, seeking new contexts for words, and going as far as the explosive and neologistic verse of Fergus MacFinlay. Scottish Gaelic poetry has been the subject of translation not only into English but also into other Celtic languages. Maolio's Cambule and Mari Nicgumarade have been translated into Irish, and John Stoddart has produced anthologies of Gaelic poetry translated into Welsh. Today, Scottish Gaelic literature is currently experiencing a revival. In the first half of the 20th century, only about 4 or 5 books in Gaelic were published each year. Since the 1970s, this number has increased to over 40 titles per annum. With regard to Gaelic poetry, this includes the Great Book of Gaelic Gaelic and Livermore, a Scottish Gaelic, English and Irish language collaboration featuring the work of 150 poets, visual artists and calligraphers. Established contemporary poets in Scottish Gaelic include Meg Bateman, Maulios Campbell, Rhoda Gorman, Aomas McNichael and Angus Peter Campbell. Gaelic prose has expanded also, particularly with the development since 2003 of the Ursargiel series published by CLAR, which encourages new works of Gaelic fiction from both established and new writers. Angus Peter Campbell, besides 3 Scottish Gaelic poetry collections, has produced 5 Gaelic novels. An Oichi Mused a Shin, Lre, Dianam Sajildala, and Te Samraid and Tilly Darkai and Fuaran Sianan Tisauel. Other established fiction writers include Alistair Campbell and his brother Tormod Campbell, Katrina Lexi Campbell, Alison Lang, Dr. Finlay MacLeod, Ian F. MacLeod, Norma MacLeod, Mary Ann MacDonald and Duncan Gillies. New fiction writers include Mari E. MacLeod and the writers of the Claire Gin Damien Hirst and Circe anthologies. In 2013, the first ever Scottish Gaelic hard science fiction novel, Air Cuin Dovdrillsich by Tim Armstrong, was published by CLAR. Within Gaelic drama, 2 Gaelic theatre companies were recently professionally active. Firclus and TOSG, which was managed by the late Simon Mackenzie. Most recently, the Gaelic drama group Togai, established by Arthur Donald, has attempted to revive the sector.